Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has called on President Trump to commit to ending the war in Iran. Albanese told the national broadcaster ABC that he wants greater certainty over Trump's objectives in Iran, along with the recognition of the economic damage it's causing to the global economy. Trump has criticised allies, including Australia, for failing to help secure the Strait of Hormuz.
And maybe in particular that country, the longest bond, the longest ally. Australia too. Australia was not great.
The Australian National University surveyed over 20,000 Australians and found that most think the nation will face multiple security shocks within the next 5 years and is underprepared for what's to come. Let's get more on the country's sentiment on geopolitical tensions and risks. Joining us now is Rory Medcalf, who's the head of the ANU National Security College. Rory, great to have you with us. And I wanted to go back to the conversation with the Prime Minister and some of the ire that Australia's leadership has attracted from the Trump administration for not pitching in, if you will, with this war. Has the alliance, the relationship between Australia and the US changed, and does that benefit or disadvantage Australia's security position in a situation like this?
Well, look, I think broadly the Australian government has been very pragmatic about the alliance in the last year or two, particularly under this Trump administration. And to set the scene a little more on that, of course, the Prime Minister of Australia had a very successful visit to the United States last year, where he secured ongoing support for the AUKUS submarine cooperation and offered a big deal on critical minerals. So I think the tensions in the relationship over the Iran conflict have to be put in that perspective. Having said that, of course, there's clearly a lot of unhappiness in the Australian community, the Australian population, about the impact that this war is having, and that's beginning to now translate into foreign and security policy. So our Prime Minister is navigating this very carefully. I don't see at the moment any critical damage to the Australia-US relationship as a result of this particular conflict, but it does reinforce a growing sentiment in the community about the volatility and the behaviour of this administration.
If you talk about preparedness for these sort of external shocks, obviously we've been through COVID, but if you take a look at the risks for Australia here, it is not just energy, it's a flow-on effects through to fertiliser, to food security, on top of energy security as well. What more could be done from a policy perspective?
Well, look, I think again, going to the public opinion first and then coming back to policy, if that's okay, the work that we've been doing to try to map Australian public opinion has showed, I think, really quite a strikingly high level of concern about national underpreparedness across all of the resilience and security issues. And in fact, ironically, getting ready for the next pandemic is one of the ones where people are a little bit more comfortable because we've been through that before. But when it comes to energy, critical infrastructure, potential cyber attacks, violent unrest, the impacts of war, there are high levels of concern. There's an argument that we've really had a window over the last 10 to 20 years to be more prepared for shocks like this, whether it was through increasing fuel stockpiles, whether it was through converting the fleets of metropolitan trucking that basically carry all the goods to our supermarkets to a fuel other than diesel, whether that's LNG or whether it's electrification. There are lots of things that haven't been done in the context of the Australian Federation, and there's now, I think, a growing impetus for a united national effort, federal government, states, territories, the private sector. But of course, it is difficult to do this after a crisis has commenced.
Rory, when you take a look at sort of public opinion, do you think there is a sense that the Australian public is still reeling from the disruptions from the pandemic? Because it feels like at the moment, when you take a look at the dynamic with the energy and the oil situation, it's less of a supply shock and more of a demand shock that we're seeing.
Yeah, look, I think, there's a bigger picture of public anxiety. So the work that we did surveying 20,000 people, looking at about 15 different security risks and potential shocks, and then getting a sense of how the population see those as likely or as consequential, and how prepared are we, and should the government be saying or doing more about these things? It's a much bigger array of risk. It is supply shocks, it's infrastructure and resilience. So we've encountered a lot of concern about the way that remote communities in Australia often have only, if you like, a single point of failure for their infrastructure, and also a sense that, a recognition that conflict and crises overseas now have an immediate impact in Australia, whether it's in terms of energy and the economy or whether it's in terms of social unrest and political violence. The context of this is also, of course, the terrorist attack at Bondi in Sydney last December. And so I think security is now on the minds of the Australian population. They want a clearer narrative from government about a whole-of-nation effort to address these issues. And this isn't going to begin or end with the consequences of this Iran conflict. I think the pandemic sure heightened that sense of anxiety, but there are much deeper currents, including demographically and economically.
Rory, what about the anxiety around issues with China as well, and how the challenges with the Trump administration perhaps changed the calculation for the administration on how to move forward when it comes to these global partnerships?
Also, the survey work we did was very specifically or very carefully not specific about naming countries. We were asking the population, what do you value, what do you want to protect, whether it's your democratic institutions or whether it's your safe and peaceful communities or whether it's your economic prosperity and so forth. But if you read between the lines of a lot of the data that we've gathered, of course there's anxiety about great powers and there's anxiety about potential coercion or potential military threats. So China is on the minds of the Australian population. We had last year, of course, the circumnavigation of this country by a Chinese Navy task group. We've had a lot of attention over the past 10 years to foreign interference and cyber intrusions and other risks. But at the same time, there's a recognition, I think, and this is borne out in our data as well, that China's not the only issue here. There's consciousness of the impact of the Ukraine war and Russia's breach of the rules-based order. There's also consciousness of the way the Trump administration has become such a volatile ally. And I think there's a deeper sense that the centre, if you like, the political centre in our system needs to hold, but is showing a lot of fraying around the edges, concern about political polarisation, disinformation, a lot of the shocks and the risks that we've seen in America and in Europe and elsewhere are beginning to hit home in Australia. This makes it incredibly difficult for government because I think if we have security and foreign policies that are only about the China challenge, that's not going to be sufficient. And instead, I think what the data suggests is a need for a greater national narrative about protecting the good things about Australian stability and democracy against any of a whole range of shocks, including conflict in our region.
Rory, always great to chat with you. Rory Medcalf, who's the head of the National Security College at ANU. We have more on Australia Ahead every Tuesday at 11:40am if you're watching in Sydney, 8:40am if you're catching us out of Hong Kong. You can also delve into the Bloomberg Australia podcast, which looks into the biggest stories shaping the country's role in global business. You can find that on Apple or Spotify. This is Bloomberg.